LWO, verify area weather conditions or go for launch.
Weather is go.
RCO, report vehicle beacon go on external power.
Beacon go.
Prop 1, verify engine regulators go.
Go.
Prop 1, report engine section temp.
82.7.
Prop 1, report lube line temp.
75.4.
Prop 1, establish vehicle fuel tank vent is closed.
Closed.
Coming up on a go for auto sequence start in 10 seconds.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition. We have liftoff of the Delta II rocket carrying the Mars Polar Lander, NASA's first visit to the red planet's southern pole.
The vehicle is responding.
I'm very happy that some of the people I know have contributed so much to my life and supporting me. And people are beautiful, and I believe that about some people don't appear to be beautiful. I think that once you get to know a person, you discover so much you didn't know, which you might never have known but for something to trigger it.
What I do, what I do, what I do, da da do, da da do.
We were living in Manhattan at that time in the Lower East Side. And at that time of history, the east side of Manhattan was a melting pot. The people there all had one thing in common. They were new to the area and they were poor, these people that I lived with at that time. My mother had come up from Jamaica having these 3 children. We lived in this area. And my earliest recollection was in grade school, in kindergarten. The people, there were people from every country you could think of. And what was so amazing was that these kids spoke good English, but their parents spoke no English. But in that period of history, the parents said to the kids, you learn English and the world is yours. And for most of the white kids, that was true. There was a small percent of blacks in this particular PS 99. So it was very mixed, very mixed. And so the kids had only one common language. There were maybe 10 languages in my kindergarten, but we all spoke one language because no one had a compatriot to talk to, so we all spoke English, and very well. People wanted to be American. You know, they just had this desire to be American. Here were all these people coming from all these countries, and one of the things that the schools tried to teach was, what's it like to be in America? I can still remember a little thing we sang in kindergarten. I can still remember the song. And the words were, I won't try to sing it, but the words were, for example, who was the postman? We had this thing we sang. The postman with his heavy bag walked and walked all day. And if he brings a letter, thank you, sir, I say. And if he brings no letter, I thank him anyway. And that was one of the songs we sang, and they had similar songs like that to describe various pieces of the American world and try to build respect for these various people who serve the society. That kind of ditty today would be so irrelevant and so out of it. But then it was what you heard, and it was very acceptable.
Come we go down, come we go down, come we go down to Kingston Market. Come we go down, come we go down, down to Kingston Market.
At about 4th grade, we made this trip back to Jamaica, and my schooling suddenly changed from being leisurely to learning algebra and trigonometry and all those subjects at age 8 and 9 in the West Indies. The British system, Jamaica was a British colony, and the British system was based on a graduation at 14 years old. And here we were based on the 18 years old. And the way the British took care of educating the people who really wanted it, at about 14, when you finished the free public schooling, the automatic free public schooling, you could take a set of exams called the Cambridge exams. And if you did well if this 14-year-old did well in those Cambridge exams, there would be schooling. Somehow it would turn out that that child got schooling. They had a lot to cover by the time the kid got to 14. On returning here, I could coast for a number of years because I'd had a lot of the stuff while I was in Jamaica for about a year and a half. I was put into the grade I had been in, 4th. And it took me a little while to demonstrate to them that I've been there and done that, so I got moved up a little bit. So my real recollections of schooling and my early life, schooling was a big part of my life then. I was the youngest of 3 kids, and the 2 older ones, Herbert, my brother, and Gloria, my sister, they had little jobs very often in people's kitchens or taking care of people's kids, because we were poor families. My mother was frequently sleep-in jobs, away from home several days in a row, and my brother and sister had jobs that took them up a lot of time, so I had a lot of time. I was told, don't go out, stay in the house, don't go out, because there was no supervision around. My mother wasn't there, my brother wasn't there, my sister wasn't there. I had a lot of time in an apartment by myself and told not to go out because nobody could keep track of what was happening. So the safest place in my mother's mind was in the house. So I did. That gave me a lot of time to think, to play with devices, and I leaned towards electrical devices. One of the miracles of my early years was that there was a book that showed how to make a battery, a lead-acid battery, thing used in a car. And I went to the pharmacy and bought 8 ounces or whatever I bought of sulfuric acid, and they sold it to me, no questions. That wouldn't happen today on a bet, because that acid is it can do real damage. But nobody thought about those things, and nobody was suing pharmacy for selling sulfuric to an 8-year-old or what have you. So I went home and made these things. I made a battery from scratch, found lead plates, and used the acid and mixed it with water, and didn't hurt myself. So I had a lot of success with my experiments and no real big downsides. So by the time I got to junior high school, I knew I wanted to be an engineer. I didn't quite know what it was, but I knew I wanted to be one of those things, engineers. And I had the good fortune, phenomenal good fortune in junior high school of meeting a teacher who made my life in a very big way. Since I had decided early on that I wanted to be an engineer, I would frequently say to a teacher, I'd like to be an engineer. And these were generally white teachers, and their response would generally be, aren't you thinking a little bit high? Or it would always be a put down. You can't do that, basically, was the message I was getting. And then in the second year of junior high school, I said once again to another teacher, another white teacher in Harlem, James Fenimore Cooper on 116th Street in Harlem, said to this man, Johnson, I want to be an engineer. His face just bloomed. And he said, you do? Well, here's how. He ran off, and then he came back and said, you must go to Brooklyn Technical High School with your interests. You must go. But the exam was given last week, and you missed it. And you missed it because we didn't publicize it. They're supposed to publicize these so-called magnet schools, Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, supposed to publicize those schools to all kids in junior high school. But in this black Harlem school, 100% black attendance, they don't bother with things like that because many of the system people think, well, these people can't do that. Same kind of mentality applied Tuskegee Airmen, which I want to go back to later on. But this man, Ernest Johnson, told me what I had to do, found out that I missed the exam the previous Saturday, missed it by a week. He didn't stop. He called the principal of Brooklyn Tech and said, I have a student who missed the exam through no fault of his own. What can we do? This principal said, have him come this coming Saturday. We'll give him the exam. Now that's, operating out of the box. But that event really made things for me. I had the good fortune of getting into Brooklyn Tech against all odds, against the odds that the system would steer me to work in the subway or something like that, or sweep the streets. And that was a major turning point in my life. It was an incredible experience in that you competed to go to the school. You competed along certain lines. You competed in tests related to physical learning about the physical world, which is a technical high school. So you had this school, nice physical plant, expensive physical plant, because these things that they were going to teach in that school covered areas you don't cover. I was doing forging, metal forging, acetylene welding, those kinds of things in that high school. And because you had all these kids who wanted to be there for those subjects, I had no biology, for example, in my high school. It was all on the physical sciences. So these kids who wanted to do that were there, and they fought to get there. So you had these motivated 6,000 kids in this one building. You had these motivated kids, and you had these motivated teachers because they loved teaching to people who loved what they were teaching. So you had this wonderful synergy between the two groups. The teachers were happy to be there because they had no discipline problems at all. They had students who hung on their every word, so to speak. I feel that in my life, there's no 4-year period in which I learned as much as I did in those 4 years. And I've been to, got a bachelor and got a master's degree, but for a given period of time, the amount that I learned per day, so to speak, in that high school was just outstanding and has stood me in good stead because I've continued in the particular field. Every day, I noticed something new in the physical world I didn't realize before, and it's always such fun. I find this world so fascinating, and I can't say why others didn't. I know that for many of the blacks who didn't go to Brooklyn Tech, they didn't go there because they too weren't encouraged to do so in New York City school system. The number of teachers who discouraged me in one way or the other, I think many of them thought they were protecting me. I think they thought they were protecting me from the disappointment I would experience when I tried to do this or that. I think some of them were well-meaning, but they too had been so conditioned to the idea that I can't or you can't because of the color of your skin, and they were trying to keep you from being hurt. Some of them were just malicious, but I think most of them were trying to save this kid from the system. And the system was not kind to us, so yeah. I think I'm a crazy optimist, and I mean that literally. I think that I'm definitely the half-full glass person. I meet lots of people who are so pessimistic. I always felt I could. When I graduated high school, I ultimately went into the Navy, and I got a lot of discouragement in applying. I was told to my face that, no, you niggers were stewards in the Navy, which in fact the steward service in the Navy is criminal. The Navy, aboard a ship, you had these wardrooms and you had these officers' quarters, and the people who served, the valets, the servants to those upper echelon people in the Navy rank system, they were black, in white coats, aboard ship. And so even though I was told when I applied for this electronic technician training, again, the technology, when I applied for this electronic technician training, I was told, no, you can't be. So I wrote a letter to the chief recruiter, New York Region, U.S. Navy, and got back a letter saying, we're terribly sorry about that incident you had. If you'll come on this date and time, you'll take the exam, and if you pass it, you'll go. Now, and I went, and I passed it, and I went in. One of the realities there is there was change going on towards the end of after the end of the Second World War, the major part of it. President Truman made remarks about we need to change the discrimination system in our military. I don't think he did much about it, but he set a tone, a new kind of thinking, which hadn't been from people at that level before. And after Truman spoke, the Secretary of the Navy, Forrestal, he also made statements about, we got to change things in the Navy. Well, they weren't changing a lot, but this man who got my letter, the chief recruiter in the New York area, probably heard some of these words about we're going to do things a little bit different. And he wrote this very apologetic letter. I'm sure that 5 years before, that would not have happened, because some of those words being said by a man in Truman's status, the president and secretary of the Navy, those words hadn't been said yet. My brother, who's 5 years older than I am, Herbert, he was in a segregated army, no ifs, ands, or buts. And there was all this problem of people believing that we blacks couldn't do this and couldn't do that. And I mentioned earlier the Tuskegee Airmen, that setting up of that training, aircraft pilot training program was mainly to prove that we couldn't do it. But we could with the training, and as many people don't know, that 99th Squadron, Tuskegee Airmen, they were feared, literally feared by the Germans. It's a fact that a German squadron would come up to attack our bombers. They'd see it's the 99th Squadron. They'd go back home. This group, this 99th Airmen, Tuskegee Airmen group, fighter pilots, never lost a bomber. Their job was to escort the bombers to the target. You lose them. You take that for granted. But this squadron, this 99th, they never. So we can certainly do it, even though much of the system thought we couldn't. And about my continuing despite these obstacles, I just am optimistic about things. I'm just an optimist. And it's still today. I'll try things that people won't. My mother, Ethelyn Amanda Kelly, also did things that others would say couldn't be done. She was different from her group, her siblings. She just had a different view of things. Part of it, I think, might have come from the fact that her father, Thomas Davis, sent her, and only her, to a finishing school. In the British world, the concept of a finishing school, where one learns manners and all the other things besides the education, she was sent to a finishing school. And there she adopted, for one thing, proper language. Now, the street corner Jamaican has an accent which comes from France and from England, and call it patois and all these other names, but there's a distinct flavor to a Jamaican and different from a Trinidadian and so on. And my mother spoke like neither from Trinidad or from Jamaica. She chose the proper English. And that sort of separated her from her family, and that was okay with her. When she built a house in Kingston, none of her family, her other siblings had a house of that level. So she just she really worked hard. She fought to be forward-going. And again, I say, despite her life, she never had any sort of high income position. She did menial sorts of things, but she knew how to make things work. Now, she lost her husband, my father, in 1929. I was 18 months when he died. So here was Ethelyn Amanda Kelly, my mother with 3 kids, one 18 months old, and the others about 3 and 5, around there, and no husband in New York City. And she managed somehow to keep it together. She was a very proud woman. We frequently did not eat because she was too proud to go on welfare, to make that public admission that she couldn't do it herself. So she would rather let us starve a little bit than go before the whole world and say, I need your help. And that has not endeared me to her. I think it was a bad choice. I think it would be better to let us eat and swallow her pride a bit, but she was a very proud woman. And because she was a very proud woman, she said from the get-go, you kids will go to college. She had no idea how it was going to happen, and she certainly never contributed any money or anything to make it happen. But we grew up with those words in our ears at all points. You're going to go to college, and we all did. And of course, I started to go to City College, New York, when I graduated high school in 1946. But I found it hard to go to school, buy books, keep myself together, because at that point I was living in a rooming house. I'd left my mother's home because I found it very difficult to live with her. And so in this rooming house situation, feeding myself, buying books, I found I couldn't do it. I started City College in February of 1946. And by April of 46, I decided I had to do something else. That's how I got into the Navy. You pass that test, called the Eddy test, after one of the Navy electronics people passes the Eddy test. It guaranteed you a year of schooling, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, a year of schooling to become an electronics technician. It was a lot to learn. And that was attractive to me. So I got a super deal. I got an education technology. I got a guarantee to have money to choose my college and go. I ended up going to Brooklyn Polytech, a private engineering school, engineering and science school in Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn at the time. It was one of those subway schools. You took the subway to the school in the day, you went to school in an office building, and you went home at night. There's no campus, no dormitories. It was strictly the stuff, learning the stuff. It was good though. You know? My first job in engineering turned out to be in a laboratory known as Polytech Research and Development. They do work in the field of what's called microwave. So before going back to the Navy and this man Johnson and how he made my life, while I was in college, there was this laboratory that developed microwave instruments. And microwave is a class of radio wave at a certain frequency, different from the frequency you might use for AM radio. It's a whole different thing. And because of that experience I had in the Navy as a microwave technician, they use microwave for radar particularly, I got a job as a technician at this laboratory, Polytech Research and Development. By the time I reached my end of my junior year, I was given the rank of engineer because I had so much experience in the Navy with microwave devices. And just a small percent of the population had that kind of background, so they made me an engineer, and so it was my first paying job under the name of engineer. But upon graduating and having my piece of paper, I applied for a number of companies away from New York City. I had developed by that time a feeling that I hated New York. I now know it wasn't New York I hated, it was the poverty I hated. And I didn't have the money to enjoy New York, but to really know New York. So I applied for jobs only in the West Coast, and I got 6 offers, and took the one from Hughes because their description was best in terms of what would I be doing. And that was very satisfying. I worked for them for 9 years, and my first stint, worked elsewhere, and went back there and had another 9-year stint at Hughes. In the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, I had a lot of contact with high school students. And at that time, I was just beginning my own career. My first as an engineer job was in 1953 with Hughes Aircraft Company. And there were a number of us in Los Angeles, Jay Edmonds, A number of us, Jay was one of my classmates at Brooklyn Tech, and we graduated together. The 6 of us graduated together out of Brooklyn Tech in 1946. And here was Jay living in Los Angeles, and I'm living in Los Angeles. I hadn't seen Jay from the time we graduated to 1953 when I ran into him at Hughes. And he took me home to meet his wife, and it turns out I was in 4th grade with his wife, and also the New York group. But in that period, we tried to interest black kids in the sciences. So for a number of years, a number of us black engineers in the area ran a program, or had an organization called Saturday Adventures into Science. What we did was, on Saturdays, we would put on a show and tell program about sciences to kids in the vicinity of the Watts Park, 103rd Street. And when we went to the local high schools, telling them what we wanted to do and would they advertise it in the schools, the school staff would basically say, our kids won't go to that program. And if you want to do something for our kids, set up a scholarship program so that we can have more scholarship winners in our schools. The teachers and the principals we ran into simply didn't understand that the disinterest of their kids was because it was presented poorly. You really can't teach science unless you know science. And very often the teachers were one page ahead of the students. That wasn't what they did for their living, so they couldn't have the excitement that we did. We'd put on exhibits, really good audiovisual presentations that couldn't help but interest the kids. We would get help from GE, came in for us, Thermador Appliances came and gave us equipment. Back in 1956 or so, Thermador had a microwave oven. Nobody had ever seen one because they were still working on it, but they had a complete system microwave oven. We borrowed that from them. They willingly lent it to us, and we cooked cupcakes in 3 minutes. And the kids, the things we presented, the kids hadn't seen, and we tied that in with education and how exciting. We tried to make engineering exciting, like the excitement of developing this thing that could cook something take an hour and 3 minutes, so on and so forth. So we had a lot of visual stuff in explaining our work. We put on a science fair in their neighborhood, this park. And though we were doing these things on Saturdays, they all came out.
Ain't gonna let nobody love turn me round, turn me round, Lord. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, on marching up to freedom land.
As far as discrimination goes, we're talking about 1953 now. A number of companies, one company in Wheeler Labs, I interviewed there, and they said that they wouldn't hire me because there was no place I could live around there. Housing discrimination was so severe that these companies were very often located in areas where blacks just couldn't hope to get a place to rent or buy. Back then, there was a thing called a restrictive covenant in the deeds of most of the land in the United States. And these deeds go back quite a ways. And you can't change a land-based covenant, condition, and restriction. It gets built in, it stays with the land. And it wasn't until 1948 that the Supreme Court called those restrictive covenants unenforceable. Not illegal, but unenforceable. So they are still on this property here. I'm sure if I go back, I'll find the same restriction, frequently against blacks and Jews in the history of the United States. But anyway, in 48, discrimination was just all over the place. So it was likely that any job I took, I'd have a hard time finding a place to live. And that was exactly what happened. It was rough. When I got to Hughes, I joined the microwave laboratory at Hughes, and I was just up my alley. So I was very pleased to get that position, and that's how I decided on that job as against some of the other offers I received. And I started at Hughes, and I was very excited about what I was doing, so I came up with some really novel stuff at a great time. And Hughes turned out to be one of the best jobs I could have taken because of a culture at Hughes that education was a good thing. So they encouraged you to go back to school. They had Hughes fellowship programs and so on, and you could go back and they'd work out your hours and so on so that you get your master's and so on. So I got my master's from the Hughes fellowship program, master's fellowship. I was there for a number of years and had good relations with my friends there. And later I learned a number of things about the world as it is and was then. After several years, a friend of mine told me that when I was being considered for the job in the microwave laboratory at Hughes Aircraft Company, Culver City, in 1953, the head of the laboratory had never had a black in his organization before, didn't know what to do about it, and so he polled the laboratory. He asked the engineers, would they mind if he hired me? I mean, normally the boss is telling people what will be. He's asking, is this okay? Fortunately, there are only a few people who said they would mind. In fact, some of them said they would leave. And in this process, apparently, this man, Lester Venata, apparently got more courage when he saw the polling numbers and so on, to the point where the ones who threatened to leave, he said, start preparing your resume. So I got the job. I got the job in a vote. And so I guess you can say it's a good thing that of this body of 100 and something engineers, a minority of them said they would object. But that was sort of the things that are going on, and I think we all blacks have this problem of what's going on back there, because they won't tell you generally. This housing thing, that was an in-your-face situation. You have a family. I was living in California and married Loretta in 1956, and we were about to have a baby. I'm looking for a house. There was a very nice tract, reasonably priced, brand new houses, tract houses, and close enough to Hughes. And I wanted to buy one of those things, and they would play games, you know, not available, blah, blah, blah. And my roommate was a white guy from Alabama. And we were quite friendly. I told him what I felt was going on, and he agreed to go there and apply for the same house that I wanted. Came back and said, oh yeah, it's available there. Still trying to sell it. They're trying to sell quite a few in that area. It was called Gardena Holly Park, the name of the development. And so I asked him, would you make an offer for me? And he thought it was hilarious. He said, yeah. He and his wife went down there, made an offer on the house, bought it. I gave him the money and bought it, got a loan on it. And when the escrow closed, Loretta, Ronald, and I moved in, and the neighbors were up in arms and so on, but it was my house. And again, the restrictive covenant being declared unenforceable, there's no legal basis for them to not let me assume the house. Even the lender, I just kept making the payments, and he never tried to foreclose on the loan or anything like that. But that experience launched me into another great part of my life. Great in the sense where it took up a lot of energy, but it was a pretty shitty situation. The housing discrimination thing, I began joining groups. There was one in Gardena. We were working against discrimination in housing, particularly with regard to blacks. And that became a major interest for the next many years. So there was like 53 where I began thinking about what happened to me and my family, and joined groups where we would go and talk against discrimination. We would asked churches in some cases to address the issue from the pulpit, tried to point out the injustice of it all and the unnecessary factor. There's no need for this situation, but it was there. And this group, Loretta and some of the other neighbors and so on, continued to talk out against this discrimination that we knew, that we had proof was going on. We bought that house in 1957. And when I took another job in the valley this time, far away from where I was living, took another job at a small company called Rantec, tried to buy a house, same kinds of problems. So a tract in Northridge, really pursued the selling agency, really interested, qualified, so on and so forth, and they kept playing their games. It turned out that another man, Robert Elliott, and his wife Barbara had become quite friendly. Robert Elliott was my boss at Hughes, but there's a lot of social interaction. In fact, the group was very social all around. And so this time I asked Bob and Barbara, would they buy this house for me and so on. So they went there, and a funny thing happened. At the point I asked them to go there, Bob, who's sort of a world-renowned professor, travels a lot, he was out of town. So Barbara decided she would go and put down deposits to hold the house, and when Bob came back, he could sign the other parts. Two things happened to Barbara. First, they wouldn't take a deposit from her. A bit of sexism there. In their minds, to have a bona fide offer, taking money from this woman, Barbara, wasn't enough. She needed to have her husband with her. So they wouldn't even start the process until they had the husband's signature. The other funny thing that happened to her was, she said, well, you know, I really want you to take this deposit so I can tie down this house. I want you to, I want to be sure to have this house. And the salesman said, it'll be here, don't worry. There's this other family, he said with meaning to her, that wants to buy it, but it'll be no problem. And she's laughing inside because she knows exactly what he's talking about. And so Bob came back and the house got bought and we moved in. And now we had both David and Ronald. And the neighbors, one of the neighbors to one side, he was really just absolutely furious because he knew that the professor had bought the house, Professor Robert Elliott. And here comes Ken Kelly. So he sees me the first day and he says, when will the professor be moving in? When will he arrive? I said, no, I'm the owner, sir, this neighbor. He slammed the door. But we lived together for many years, and one day, like 10 years later, he came to me and he said, you know, your kids, Ronald and David, they don't throw rocks in my pool like some of the other kids do. So that was his way to say, I accept you. The sales force that had been selling this tract, Buckingham Estates was the name of the tract, the salesman, the person who headed that sales force was an older guy, white-haired older guy, who headed this sales force. And I invited him, this head of the sales force, and the head of the tract, the company that was building the house, I invited him to my house to talk about what I went through in getting the house and how I felt about it all. And they came, I guess, because they didn't know what to expect, and whatever, they came. This head of the sales force and the owner of the project. And we told them how we felt. The sales force guy, the head of the sales force, said at one point, he was standing at one point, and he's standing like this, and he says, in all my years in the business, I've never had this kind of situation, and the rest of those houses will not sell. He's telling the owner of the tract. And I said, I said to this guy, you need a new sales force. No sales force can do anything they believe they can't do. So they fired this selling agency and hired another one, and they sold the rest of the houses, and we lived in that house for 20 odd years. Boys grew up there, Ronald went to CSUN there, The elementary school was right nearby, outstanding elementary school, because it was on the campus of CSUN, so it was sort of a experimental teaching setup. And Ronald and David really got a good foundation. When I came to the Valley in 1963, I joined our local Fair Housing Council, a large one, Fair Housing Council of San Fernando Valley. And with that group, we did a lot of testing, demonstrating that discrimination was going on. And we also did a lot of talking to realtors and to others, builders, the Pacific Coast Builders Association. We would go there, Fair Housing, and talk about this injustice and argue that it really isn't necessary to do it. You may think that you're hurting your business by allowing integration, but I point out that we would point out that that income, if you have a business that is just 10% short of what you need to have in terms of revenue, there's this other group of people, blacks, who also make income, and they could very well be the turning point on the margin. Those kinds of arguments to try to make it make sense. But after a while, we learned that you can go and talk to somebody till you're blue, and you think you're getting through by your words, but they have their guard up. And so they'll sit and listen to a lecture for an hour or so, and they'll go home, and they'll feel good about having listened, and so, but they go right back to their patterns. You can't do anything from outside. You must be inside any institution to affect it. Because it's only then that they put their guard down and you become, you know, one of the arguments about integration is, well, it's bad for business. But when I got my first job in the Valley, in this White Valley, the instructor for Century 21 said something to the effect, well, you can go out there, but you won't get any business. Again, that's his perception. In that Century 21, my first Century 21, I became the top broker, top commission. And I just went out, again, this business about your attitude. That guy may have felt I wouldn't get any business. I knew I would. I mean, I had no experience to prove it. But beliefs make such a difference in one's life. I knew that I could sell real estate, and I did. And it's only the belief that made it possible. One of the things that I struggled with, Loretta and I talked about it a lot, what happens to a black kid when he grows up in a community or an area which is predominantly other? We were the only blacks in this basically white area. And the way I dealt with it in my head anyway, and I think Loretta felt the same way, that we had many black relatives and friends, and that there would be enough of a black experience for Ronald and David, because we'd have the birthday parties and it would be with our friends of many years, and they would be black. And then living there, parties began to be more and more white as Ronald and David met their fellow students, and ultimately sort of all white in a way. But at this point, one thing I would say, whites have their fingers in more pots than blacks do. And Ronald and David got exposed to many kinds of occupations and many kinds of people with power. To this day, Ronald has many of his college and high school friends as friends, and many of them have good jobs and good positions. For example, he has this wonderful pool in the backyard. It was built for him at a modest cost by one of his buddies who owns a pool company, and on like that. There are just so many areas in which whites do have a lead. The networking, some of the best jobs and best projects in the world are achieved by networking, not by your ability alone. It's who's got the power to say yes and no. And Ronald knows lots of people who helped him in various ways. He doesn't think about skin before he moves something. He just, who do I know? What do I need? And he just goes and does it. And he has many good friends who are white and who he's known for years. He's a very sociable person. I don't know what the future holds for Ronald. He's gone into a very difficult business, charter jet work, and I don't understand the market in that area. I don't know what he can expect. But I do know that the thought he came up with and getting it off the ground and buying his company, buying a couple of jets, that took a very broad view of the world, broadness of view of the world that you don't get by living in any of the small worlds that exist within the bigger world. And blacks have that disadvantage. I noticed that I see so many trucks coming through the valley with Hispanic names in them, because many of the people who own those companies, they come from a country where they owned businesses there. And the black group as a whole in America have had fewer opportunities of business success. Getting loans for business used to be almost impossible for blacks. And so anything that expands our contact base, I think is going to make a big difference for us as a group within this larger group of America.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
The business of knowing one's history is one thing. Being constrained by that history is another thing. And that's what I think. I think that one can know the history, but not have their life limited. Too many people know the history, at least my contact. They know the history and are affected by the fair element of knowing it. Well, this happened, so I'm not going to try this, and that happened. You can get buried by your history. What we need to do is create a new history, and it's possible. It has been the American thing from the get-go. People came from Europe in one set of circumstances and came here and blossomed into another new and better circumstance, so that we can say that people can come out of adversity and go forward, I really believe. And I think that we blacks have had less success with this blossoming. The whites who came here had no systematic walling them off from growth and certain opportunities. At the time of the building of America, we were positively walled off and so identifiable. You know, one of the funny things about the black experience in America is when America got off its feet, they needed labor, needed desperately. And they tried getting labor by getting whites out of jail in Europe and all the other things. And people were poor, came to get an opportunity here, and they would take on indentured service. And the trouble with them was that they were white and they could disappear, and they did. And our problem was that we couldn't disappear, and that fact was taken advantage of to a fairly well. So, yeah, we have a terrible, real history of defeat, horrible conditions, death, rapes. I mean, it's a hell of a history, the history of blacks in this country. But I don't think knowing it is that valuable unless it encourages you to do more, to beat it somehow. And I think we can. I think it's happening now. I think Martin Luther King's really outstanding campaign opened lots of doors, and many of the kids today don't know that the doors had to be opened. So I'm optimistic that in the long run we will really become part of the American scene. Interesting thing about Martin Luther King's work, in my view, by looking at the statistics, the group that was most helped by Martin Luther King is the white female. And most white females don't know that. But once the Congress began to think in terms of minorities, it became minorities and women. And there are women CEOs, there are women pilots today who don't know they wouldn't have had that job had it not been for Martin Luther King. So suddenly, white women not having the black skin, it's no contest that the effect for women, many of the things that Martin Luther King was fighting against are still there. It's a whole nother world for women. Is not a whole nother world for blacks yet, but I think it can get there. I think if there's more contact between the ones who have been successful in what they're doing and the ones who are maybe a couple steps down the ladder, there needs to be more contact. And it's hard to do because, ironically, the more successful a black is in a certain area, the more a black CEO of a big corporation now has fewer opportunities. The job demands so much of that person, fewer opportunities to hobnob with and educate persons who haven't come that far. Let's say take a head of a Norton antivirus and take a head of some of those companies, and if the rest of us can know more about the existence of these people, very often you see an article in the paper saying that this black person has for the first time attained this. We got to get rid of that first time. Like when I was in the Navy, some said that I was the first technician. I have since met others, blacks, that nobody knew about. I think of Drew, Dr. Drew. He discovered uses of blood plasma that made a huge difference in the outcome for wounded in the Second World War. And one of the games I love to play is somehow ask this person, that person, who caused this new statistics on injury deaths and so on and so forth. Whites and blacks alike don't know. And there's so much of that kind of thing out there where blacks are just doing it. They're not parading or blowing any whistles. They're just doing it. And because they're just doing it, we don't know they're there. So I think that what we as a group have to do is work very hard to make these things known. And it's difficult because we don't control the media. Bottom line is, I think groups of us ought to get together and do PR basically and make ourselves and our country more aware. There are these books that, for example, that list all the inventions, many of them during the automobile, that were blacks, but who knows it? And I think we have to do somehow get it more out there. My mother had always had difficulty having children. I think that it wasn't her natural calling. And one day in 1941, latter part of 1941, my mother came home one day and the dishes weren't washed. She'd been away for several days in her sleep-in job. She came home and the dishes weren't washed. And she flew into a rage. She broke up every dish in the house. And then she sent Gloria to the YWCA on 37th Street in Manhattan and sent Herbert and myself to the YMCA on 135th Street. And so there we were, my brother and I living in this room and Gloria living in the YWCA. And not too long after we got there, December 7th, 1941 happened, and Herbert was drafted almost immediately. And Herbert had always been, around. He was very helpful to me in so many ways. I remember once I had a swollen foot, and he carried me to Mount Sinai Hospital on Fifth Avenue on his back. And I'm sitting on top of him like a kid would, but here's this pretty grown boy, but I couldn't walk, and we didn't have a wheelchair, and so he carried me to the hospital. So there we were living together, and he got drafted almost immediately. And that left me living in the room alone. I'm now 13, 14, somewhere around there. she's a woman who should never have had children, and it was just unfortunate. I don't know what all she felt, but one thing was clear, that we were not a joy to her life. And at that point, over the dishes and the thing, she just split. And what it made us feel, I think all of us, I know I felt valueless, you know, that to be just thrown that way to this environment, which fortunately turned out to be supportive, more supportive than my mother was, because all these men had various bits of knowledge and activities, and which I got to share at close hand. So I didn't feel bereft. I didn't feel badly that this happened. I was puzzled, but I immediately got involved with the men who were living there and the activities there, and I think I certainly enjoyed some of the independence I had. My life was my own. There was no one in charge of me, so to speak. I had school. It's a very exciting school. It was just wonderful to be in a school where the students were all so interested in the subject, and the teachers were so pleased to teach us the subjects. So, and the friendship I got from the men and some of the women, adult women there, who accepted this kid, and they didn't diss me. They let me be and treated me warmly and let me be part of some of their lives. So it was quite a gift to get the kind of support and acceptance from a group that I wouldn't expect to get it from. They're 40 and I'm 13, 14 and silly as I think 13 and 14, but they never made me feel bad or they just accepted me. I think they smiled a lot. A lot happened that was pleasing, despite all the other stuff that you might think of. In that high school period, I had a girlfriend who was beautiful and friendly, and her parents, her mother, again, another single parent, had 3 girls. And so that was a nice piece of my daily life in that period. So it was, nothing happened in that period that was truly unpleasant. I mean, the breaking of the house was, it was supplanted, the apartment was supplanted by all these new people and the independence and all the kinds of things I was exposed to, which I wouldn't have been exposed to if I had been living in the apartment. I met Gordon Parks was one of the men living in the Y at that time, so I knew him well. In fact, when he was working for Time magazine and he was stationed in France, I had been invited to England by a family that met my brother during the war, during the Second World War. And they liked him so much, they wrote to all of his family, myself, my sister, my mother. But I was the only one who really kept up a correspondence. And in 1951, they said, why don't you come to England for the summer, for your break from college? And I politely said no the first time, but they wrote back and said, we can afford it, really, we'd like you to come. So I went there for 10 weeks, and during that time, I went to Paris and saw Gordon Parks in the magazine, Life magazine, I'm sorry, yeah, in the Life magazine office there in Paris. So, as I say, the Y experience opened many doors to me, so to speak, that would never have been open. I wouldn't have been able to walk in on Gordon Parks in the Paris office and be greeted warmly and that kind of thing, you know. So it was, a lot came out of the Y days, and the independence, it was nice. Being your own boss at that age, wow. Yeah. In 1951, a mutual friend introduced me to a young woman by the name of Gloria White, and I was really attracted to her. Our relationship grew, and we became each other's steady. We even planned our wedding date over a year before we actually got married. And we did lots of things together. She was in Brooklyn College and I was at Brooklyn Polytech. both students, and we decided that when I graduated in June of 1953, we would get married in June 10th of 53. So we did get married, and Gloria was the only daughter of a woman by the name of White, and we call her Mom White, was what we called her. And Mom White had this only daughter, and she was living in a brownstone with her daughter's aunt, her sister, and the sister's husband. So here were these three people, Mom White and Unky, we call her, the uncle, and Charlotta was the aunt. And they were very approving of our relationship. Had a nice wedding and took off to see the family in Georgia. And on our way back to New York, I was starting up this highway, and the truck was coming down. I never knew what happened exactly until years later I figured out what happened. The truck jackknifed, but I didn't know that, and none of the people looking at the accident and so on ever mentioned it. So I, for years, didn't know exactly what happened. All I know is that I was going down this road, no car ahead of me, and this truck on the other lane coming this way, and the next thing I know, the car is spinning violently, so violently that it threw us both out of the passenger door. I skidded to a stop gradually, but Gloria was stopped very suddenly and was killed instantly. And that was devastating. I was in the hospital, and I heard that Mom White was coming down, and I thought to myself, how will they greet me? I've been involved in the death of their only daughter. Here was this daughter who was doted on by her mother, by her aunt, and by her aunt's husband. These four people who meant everything to each other. And when I heard Mom White was coming down, I couldn't sleep at all that night. How do I face this woman, having in any way been involved in the death of Gloria? And when Mom White got there, she rushed into the room and grabbed me and said, "Thank goodness at least one of you survived." That was the last in the world I expected to hear. And she took me from the hospital, took me to her house, and I stayed there for months while the whole three of them, Unky, Charlotta, and Mom White, they all were just there for me and rallied around me and would say such things as, you'll be okay, you'll marry again. Mom White would say, you'll marry again, I want to have grandchildren. And it was the most incredible experience with a person who had suffered so big a hurt, and then rallying around me. When I came out to California, Mom White came out shortly afterwards to fix up my apartment, and she is absolutely, Mom White, the most important and beautiful person in my life, in that without her help in that tragedy, I don't know where I'd be. All of them now are dead. Mom White's dead, Charlotta's dead, and Unky is dead, but those three people gave me a life, because I lost one at that time. I had wished so dearly that I had died instead, so that I wouldn't have to deal with the aftermath. But it was, if everyone can learn how important other people are to them, and when one can experience the kind of selfless behavior of Mom White, Unky, and Charlotta, it was one of the most meaningful and beautiful and terrible all at the same time experiences in my life. Mom White was the most beautiful person I've ever known. And she said when Gloria died, within days of Gloria's death, she held me and said, "You will marry again someday. I want to have grandchildren." And she did. Ron and David, they didn't quite understand early on who she was, but they knew she was a loved person, and they treated her as a proper grandmother should be treated. She came out several times, and so did Charlotta, and so did Unky. So they were a great support system in my life. And I met Loretta because of Mom White. Mom White wanted me to marry again. She wanted me to have a full life. And every time I'd go to New York, I'd go to New York in business. She would invite some of the girls that Gloria knew, invited them over. And on one of these outings, I took a liking to Loretta, and we got married in New York. Of course, Mom White was there, and Unky and Charlotta. And since Loretta knew Gloria, and since Loretta knew Mom White and the others, I never had to explain to Loretta who Gloria was and all this sort of thing, because she knew the whole story. She was part of it. She was at the wedding, Gloria and my wedding. So it was just one of those things that you can't anticipate, and you don't know how you'll react, and the range of emotions that I went through in that period. But Mom White was there, just there in a way that saved me. Saved me. And Mom White lived for many years after that, so she saw the boys grow up. Yeah. In all her grief, she was able to come and say, "At least one of you survived." Wow. I've met some good people, lots of good people. David had problems of health problems, which limited him in taking advantage of the environment. And schizophrenia is such a destroys a human being, and David suffered a lot. And being ill, he was also different. Schizophrenia makes behavior to be largely irrational, and it's very hard on the victim of the illness. And it's hard on the people that he's contacting with, because the victim of schizophrenia's behavior is so off the wall that it's hard to have friends. And so he suffered in many ways, ostracized because of his difficulty. And he was able to struggle with that illness for about 17 years, but finally it got too big a struggle. It's one of the ugliest of illnesses, because statistically, you're bright, high IQ, and at the same time, you can't use it. Life just is so distorted, you don't know what's real and what's not. And they're still trying to learn more things about that illness. It is poorly understood, and medications that work are few and far. But with David, despite 1 year's full in the hospital and many years of seeing various doctors, they never found a medication that worked for him. And that's common with many schizophrenics. They don't find the combination. There's no single cocktail that'll do it. And shortly before David died, he said to me, none of the medications ever stopped the hallucinations. And I didn't know that. I thought that some of the medicines helped some of the time, but he said none of the medications ever helped the hallucinations. So he had this terror of not knowing what was going on half the time, because there's this movie, A Beautiful Mind, which talks about a schizophrenic scientist or mathematician, and as the movie gets across, what appeared to be happening with him was so real for him that when his wife found out what was really going on, she was just blown away by seeing the effect. One of my regrets is that when he was alive, I spent so much time thinking about his getting well, having him put in the hospital and so on, going to see all these doctors. And I fear that I didn't spend enough time just accepting him as he was. I was always focused on fixing it. And I regret that. I wish I had been more able to stop thinking about his illness and just relate to him, just accept him, and not try to fix it. And one of my problems is, I'm an engineer, I'm a fixer. They say that when women talk about something, they don't want a solution, they just want to talk about it. And men, as soon as she starts talking, men, they say, want to fix it. And I think that's true. And I think that men are much less able to deal with things as they are and listen without wanting to, just accepting the fact somebody wants to talk. And when David would talk crazy, as he often did, as his characteristic of the illness, I'd be trying to convince him, no, David, that's not what's happening at all. Instead of just listening because he wanted to talk. When I interrupted him and tried to tell him it's not so, I know intellectually that the illness is such that he believes what he's saying, and my saying it isn't so, though in fact it isn't, didn't help any. That's one of the big regrets dealing with David. I'm very sorry that I could have gotten out of the fix-it role and just, here's a human being talking to me and I'm talking to him, and I know he has these problems and I didn't accept it well enough. In the way of the most intimate part of personal life, marriage and dissolution of marriage, I wish that didn't happen. A part of me regrets very much that things evolved that way. But it's something that happens to people. And you look back on it and you think about how did it happen, and it happens in so many little ways, and finally has this huge effect. And I think, gee, if I'd been able to deal with some of those little ways that things were happening, it might have been different. I would like to have been married 50 years, 60 years. I go to those celebrations, and I think it's very nice when people can work at things well enough, long enough, to not have these huge disruptions that occur. For Ron and David, our divorce, rather than mine, was a surprise to them because we didn't fight in the house. They were surprised, genuinely surprised, but we were a couple that didn't talk much, and there was very little evidence of the turmoil going underneath. I met Ann, and the funny thing is that I met Ann while pursuing one of my major activities, the fair housing movement. She was inventing anti-discrimination plans in Michigan, and I was inventing plans for here, and we were both funded by the Ford Foundation in the work we were doing. And so HUD had us come to a meeting, and we were on the same meeting about fair housing, and got to know each other and developed quite a relationship with each other. And I adopted Ann's son, Stephen. And now Stephen and his wife, Chrissy, have a son of their own, my grandson, Roman Scott Kelly. In my engineering career, the several positions I had before at other companies ended up working for JPL directly. In other positions, I'd made components for JPL, but as a contractor on the outside. But finally, I ended up there, and I was thinking about retirement. I was getting up to the point where I'd be retiring, and JPL turned out to be my last job, and it turned out to be a fascinating one. The robots that we send to other planets, they're subjected to extreme environments that are very much unlike Earth here. For example, if you have something rotating here, you put some oil on the bearing and it works fine. In space, where there's no air and so on, that lubricant that we think of here can become granular and not be a lubricant at all, just freeze things. So there's so many things to be designed anew, but my part was the communication. It has always been, my work has really always been around two things, radar systems and communication systems. And at JPL, when they send a robot to some distant place, they need a microwave link. They need an antenna that will send energy back to Earth with the data imposed on the wave signal, much like the TV picture is transmitted on a microwave frequency and gets turned into a picture. Well, we do the same thing there. And the other problem is we have to send commands to it. So the antennas have to achieve certain functions so that each time they make a different shape or kind of robot, they need a different kind of antenna link, and that was my field there. So that on several of the vehicles, I have an antenna doing something or the other. Doing one of those robots can take 5 years from the time it's defined what it needs to be and getting it done. And in that time, they have to do testing of those devices in space-like conditions, except it's not space. For example, the sun radiation when you're out at some of these other planets is quite different than it is here in intensity and then the vacuum that's out there. So they have to have chambers, some of them very impressive at JPL, where they simulate those outside conditions and test things because you don't get to fix it. So in that sense, the work was most difficult of all the things I've done in the sense that there are factors you have to consider that you never thought of considering. I mean, you want to lubricate something, put some oil on it. But boy, it's a different world out there. And since these projects often take something like 5 and sometimes more years to do, the connection with the people working on it is very special, very special. And sometimes you win, and sometimes you lose. Sometimes it gets there, and we've lost a number of vehicles for one reason and another. And sometimes it gets there, and like the Mars exploration rovers that are there now and operating, I worked on that one, and they both landed, and they both operated longer than we ever expected. Right now, JPL has the Cassini probe up at Saturn, and it has a 4-year mission of taking data on various aspects of Saturn, its moons, its atmosphere, et cetera, and it took 7 years to get there. The Cassini probe, 7 years to get there, no human intervention, nobody can fix anything, and then when it gets there after 7 years, it has a 4-year assignment of data, so it has to work for 11 years to be considered a success. And it takes so much to figure out about how do we make it do that, what safeguards you have to put in, what design details. So JPL has been the most interesting of the companies I've worked for. A lot of the earlier work had to do with munitions, fighter aircraft, radar systems, and so on, microwave-guided missiles, a lot of work on that. Hughes Aircraft, which was my first engineering job as a full-degree engineer, they developed the Falcon missile. And there was an attitude at Hughes that was different from other companies. It had always been in the war games thing, the idea was to shoot at a plane and get as close as you could and have it blow up, and then shrapnel may or may not take it down. And Hughes came along with the when there were only 17,000 people then, they went to 90,000 before it was all over, but when it was 17,000, some of the engineers said, no, we're not going to get close to an aircraft and blow up anything. We're going to hit it to kill. It's a new concept that at these great distances, you could actually hit a craft. And so the guided missiles that they developed, the Falcon series, was the first to do that. And one of the tests for the military, the missile flew right up the tail of the jet aircraft, seeking on the heat. And then this concept is now common. All the people who make these kinds of weapons, they are the hit to kill idea. But the beautiful thing about Hughes was they really took chances with ideas because it was privately owned. Hughes was at that time privately owned. Other companies would be worried about the balance sheet, but Hughes had the freedom to do whatever they wanted without worrying about shareholders. Shareholders have a huge effect on how companies run, unfortunately, because they're only interested in money. But in my career in engineering, the early days had to do with munitions. Then the next I got into the business of the space race. When we were planning to do the Apollo missions, man to the moon, the company I worked for, Rantec, was the subcontractor to a company called Collins Radio in Richardson, Texas. And we had to build a system of large antennas. 9 were sprinkled around the world, so to speak, and 3 of them were the major ones at 3 places, so that we would always be in touch with an Apollo flight. The Earth is turning, and the Apollo is going over here, but every few hours, a different antenna can see it, and the others can't see it. So we had to build a system of several antennas, and that was one of the first space-related jobs I had for communications. But I ended up in that area. Before going to JPL, I got into the business of the space communications satellites. Nowadays, DirecTV, all those things, they are looking at a satellite out there. And I got into the business with Rantec of designing the ground stations by which the big connection with the satellite. We all have the little 18-inch dish, but there needs to be a very big dish to send signals up there and receive weak signals back. So a lot of my later life engineering was in communication satellites. What happened was, after we got them up there, these satellites for TV and radio and so on, all the countries wanted them. So I got to do antennas for Lebanon, Jamaica. There's one, Jamaica. I designed the feed for that, the microwave design of that. Portugal, quite a few countries. So I got to go to, I spent several times going to places like Sweden, Copenhagen, France, Germany, England, in connection with designing these ground stations for communication satellites to get the information they need and so on. So that was the most exciting part of my career in terms of travel. And I went to a hotel one night and just arrived, got off the plane, went to a hotel in London, and there was a guy playing the piano, and I said, I'd like to hear some music from West Side Story. Some beautiful songs in that piece. So he plays one of them for me, and then he plays some others, and then I have to go meet some people, so I give him a tip. I have no idea what I gave him. I thought I know what I gave him, but I wasn't sure. But I gave it to him not thinking about it at the time. Went into my room, got ready for my appointment. I came down again. I'm heading out of the hotel. He spots me, and he stands up and goes back into West Side Story. It must have been a good tip. When Christopher was first born, I looked at him in wonder. There was something very special about the next generation. In fact, one day I was there just drinking Christopher in with my eyes, and Ronald said, with a little bit of exasperation, "Talk to him." And that was something I was too busy, being fascinated by this person, this little person, and I didn't know what to say to him. And And Ronald convinced me that you don't have to think of what's for him, just speak and tell about your day, anything. It's all language going in to him. And he's always been very energetic and outgoing, and he has such an active life of the various things he's scheduled to do. But he's developed into a fascinating person to me. And one of the evidences of this fascination I see in him, I've taken him to I've taken him to the Getty Museum in Brentwood. I've taken him to the Peters Car Museum on Fairfax area of Wilshire Boulevard. I've taken him to the planetarium, the new planetarium that opened. Taken him to the Pacific Aquarium down in Long Beach, very big. And at each one of these places, he is so thorough in his looking. He reads the labels, he studies the objects, and he looks like a veteran museum goer. And then he always reaches a point where he says, that's enough. He has this uncanny ability to know what he can absorb and know when to stop. And when we were at the Getty Museum, we went to this one building, the North Building, and he was studying all the paintings and so on and so forth with such interest. And then he said, basically, that's enough for today. We'll come again. We'll come again and see some of the other buildings. So he really wakes me, and then he's in these little plays at school. But it's such fun to watch him grow. And this maturity he has when we go to museums and such, it just blew me away. I didn't expect that kind of thing. We were at the aquarium down at Long Beach. He went through every part of that aquarium. He wore his grandma out and had to sit down. And he's still going. You know, like the Energizer Bunny, he's still going through different areas and looking at things with such intelligent look on his face. And he's just a joy, and playing games with him is such fun. Yeah, he's a very special kid. I guess all grandparents say that, but Christopher's a very special kid. And he's very vocal, and he speaks very well. We love it when, for example, we're discussing something and he'll say, well, actually, and then go off where he's going. So he's a lot of fun, and I think he's going to be really quite a human being, quite an adult. He's beautiful, he's bright, he appreciates things. I just can't get over how he behaves in a museum. I don't think any kid that age behaves as maturely as I see him behave, especially the part, we will do the other part some other time, of the Getty Museum. That's a big statement because that's a big museum up there on the hill. I'm very curious to see what he's going to gravitate towards in terms of a life work. I don't see any particular signs of his becoming a scientist or an engineer, but too early to tell. He laughs easily, and his friends like him. He likes them, and they like him, and that's a beautiful thing to have at his parties and other things. You can see the interaction between himself and the others. And he's had 2 dogs around him much of his life, Cleo and Caesar, and they're both gone now, but he was very attentive to the animals, very considerate of all of the things in his environment. Yeah, I look forward to seeing who he's going to be when he grows up. I would say to Christopher that life begins to be good when you look for the good, that in any situation there's usually some bad and some good, and look for the good, contribute wherever you can to your own health and to the health of those around you. Share learning and get learning. Share learning and get learning. Discovery is a wonderful activity, and learning is discovery. And giving depends on what the situation is, but there's always need. There's always joy, there's always sorrow to be dealt with, but there's always need. So I would say to Christopher, learn to give and learn to learn and be upbeat. There's always a downside. Look for the good side, I would say. Yeah. And I think Chris will have a good life. He has a good head. Yeah. So, go, Christopher. Looking back in my life, I see the value of people, and people really make our world. And the newspapers, sort of, their nature is to report the bad, but there have been so many wonderful things that have happened to me, and terrible things, and surviving the terrible things has, in my case, been help from people who want to lift you up. And I see my life, two things in my life, that I've met some wonderful people and they have made my life more wonderful, or co-workers, friends. There's so many ways in which other people affect one's life. And my looking at people in a positive way has been a boon for me. I know a lot of people are very suspicious of everybody. The warmth with which I look at others has served me well, and I think I have been helpful to others, and that's always a nice feeling, to be helpful to others. The work we did with the high schools in our promoting science was very good. So I see myself as having had a great deal of good luck and warmth, and part of it is giving. It's got to be a two-way thing. And the other thing that I consider to be important to the quality of my life is my health. There are many people who have so much to give, but their life is cut short. And I feel wonderful at this age, and a lot of my friends have died, so I feel I've been granted longevity, good health, a lot of wonderful people that I've known, and a lot of things I've been able to give to others. And I feel like I've had a very fortunate life. I look at some of those other countries like Darfur, what's going on in Darfur now. It's just, it is so hard to fathom how people get into that situation to be so willing to kill so readily. And I think of other lives I might have had. I think that I've been very fortunate, and I feel good about that good fortune, and sad about some of the stuff that's going on, but I don't know how to fix it. And all I can live is my life, and it has worked very well for me despite tragedies. I've had quite a series of them, but still I look at the good times and the good things, and I'm just feeling very fortunate. That's a very nice feeling to have. There are people who feel that life has cheated them. I've been cheated in some instances, but I don't see my overall life that way, and I've had some wonderful experiences. Traveled, the Navy, 3 years at sea. It's quite an experience to go all the places we went, and the storms were terrible. I never got over getting seasick, but the nice thing was that eventually the storm would go away and I'd feel fine, and I'm looking always for the storm going away, whatever storm it is. Yeah. But to have had Ronald and David was a beautiful experience. I remember when David came home from the hospital, you know, there was so much hope there, never dreaming what would happen. But David, despite his later illness, he had some good years too. So I've had good luck.